Joe Romm, in my opinion, is one of the most tough-minded advocates for climate action, and also one of the most outspoken critics of the climate deniers. He has a long history of engagement in the climate issue, from working with the White House, working with non-governmental community, and being a spokesman on a continuing basis for various outlets in the national press. I've heard scores of presentations on national security, and very seldom do the speakers who are going to be assistant secretaries of defense or going to be undersecretaries of state, very seldom do those individuals bring up issues that move beyond the traditional definitions of national security, to undertake and really probe issues like climate change and how that relates to national security, environmental destruction, population. Joe is one of the few who has weaved together what I believe is a very much more rational and much more 21st century view of how we ought to deal with this world. Let me read you a quote from a recent statement of Joe's. "Feeding some 9 billion people by mid-century in the face of a rapidly worsening climate may well be the greatest challenge the human race has ever faced." Absolutely right. And absolutely the kind of analysis and the kind of uncompromising statement that has to be engaged in the debate. Joe is a graduate of MIT, an undergraduate and graduate, is currently a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, which is really kind of the progressive think tank in Washington, providing lots of help both to the current administration and to progressive forces throughout the government and the country. So Joe, we're really pleased to have you here. I've never been in a session where you gave anybody an inch. You always said, you got to defend that, you got to take that on, and I am in agreement with 99% of what Joe says. That's why he's here today. No, it's just wonderful, Joe, to have you here. Thanks ever so much for coming.
Wow, that is a hell of an introduction. I'm hopefully today going to, almost everything you know about climate change solutions is outdated. And that is a series I began on my blog several months ago as I realized the world is changing so fast that mainstream organizations like the New York Times, major politicians, the cognoscenti, don't understand what's happening. The world has fundamentally transformed in the last 5 years, and it is to the point where we know what the future is. Oxford University Press asked me to write the climate change book in their series, What Everyone Needs to Know. They have what everyone needs to know about China and what everyone needs to know about Islam and agriculture. And so I was able to spend 6 months just reviewing the literature and talking to the experts. And even I just had not comprehended how fast the world has changed. And, one of the things I say in the book, I don't, for many years I would try to persuade people to become climate activists. And I don't, that's not my frame anymore. My frame is, over the next 25 years, climate change and our response to it will have as much impact on you and your family as the internet has in the last 25 years. And the people who, if you could go back 25 years and know what the world was going to look like today, you could make a lot of choices, what to study, what your kids study, where to invest, that would have transformed your lives. And that's where we are with climate change. The future is pretty clear. I can't tell you the timing of everything that's going to happen, but I can tell you what's going to happen. I think that there are going to be 2 groups of people. The people who are informed, AKA the smart money, and then there's going to be everyone else. And so you just need to know about climate change because it is life-altering for everyone you know and everyone you care about. I just want to briefly say I owe a big debt to Colorado. I started my energy career thanks to Hunter Lovins, whom I see way back, and Amory Lovins. I lived here for 2 years in Basalt back in 1991, where I worked with Amory. And he was nice enough to write a nice letter to Hazel O'Leary recommending every single job that you could possibly have in the administration. And I think he actually believed that there was someone on the earth who would listen to such a letter. But because this 22-year-old named Bryson Bickerton in the Office of Personal Affairs knew who Amory was, he actually sent it to Bill White, who was the deputy secretary, and he called up Amory and arranged the meeting, and I ended up being special assistant to Bill White for a couple of years. Then I went to become acting assistant secretary, principal deputy assistant secretary for efficiency and renewables. I had a very long title, and I was incredibly fortunate to become acting assistant secretary under Federico Pena, who I can definitely say is one of the great public servants, and just working underneath him was I did learn at the Department of Energy at a talk like this what the definition, Washington, D.C. is all about politics, and I like to leave Washington to other places where it's not so much about politics. I learned the definition of politics, which is comes from the Greek poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning small blood-sucking insects. And that has stayed with me for a very long time for some reason. I used to, because I came out of the Office of Efficiency and Renewables, we back in the 90s, we said, here's what's going to happen. You make the investments in these technologies and we will transform the world. And people said, yeah. But real men use coal, oil, and gas. And it was much the same with climate scientists. Climate scientists says, you keep pouring the CO2 into the air, you're going to transform the world. And they said, yeah, well, we'll believe it when we see it. So here we are. 25 years later, the climate scientists were right. Everything they warned about, extreme weather, extreme drought, sea level rise, ocean acidification, it's happening. But the other interesting thing that's happening is, finally, this clean energy revolution. And that's what I'm going to talk about, run through some slides on. Tim asked me to be provocative. That is the equivalent of asking Donald Trump to say something disqualifying. And by the way, those of us who vote in the District of Columbia where it doesn't count are so counting on Colorado to win this, win the Electoral College, if nothing else. I have had a lot of readers. I still write for climateprogress.org, the blog I founded 10 years ago after John Podesta was nice enough to hire me at the center, and been writing 2 or 3 million words since then. And there are not a lot of great energy writers, so the competition wasn't great. And it's not necessarily because I know lots of stuff, but my father was a newspaper editor, so meeting deadlines was never a very big problem for me, and I've been very, very lucky to have this job. So let me I'll just briefly run through the climate science stuff because it merits mentioning, because we are talking about the greatest existential threat to the American way of life and to your children and your grandchildren, and the fact that we're not talking about it every day is in some sense a great moral failing of every leader in this country. This is the overview of the new energy climate reality, and I'm going to run through this quickly because we will be able to dive into this in Q&A. So solar power, wind power, electric vehicles, batteries, LED prices have plummeted. They have plummeted generally along a learning curve, which means the more you deploy them, the lower their prices, and their performance improves. This issue that you hear that somehow the grid is not going to be able to swallow all the renewables that we build, that's the issue of variability and integration of renewables has essentially been solved. I say that as a physicist. There's nothing challenging about it. And as the world comes to realize you can have an unlimited supply of incredibly cheap solar power during the day, What's going to happen? Well, for 50 years, we tried to persuade people to dump their load during the nighttime. So it's not surprising that we're changing the grid, that there's a little bit of a mismatch. But I can assure you there's 100 businesses, probably in Colorado alone, that are working to figure out how to move the load to the daytime. Among them, of course, being all the electric vehicle manufacturers who would love to sign long-term contracts for carbon-free power for 2 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour as far as the eye can see. And that's just one of about a half a dozen of the solutions. The interesting thing about energy efficiency, it's here now. And so I feel obliged to say Amory Lovins and Hunter Lovins were right. Electricity demand in this country has been flat for a decade, even though GDP has risen since the crash. And the same, by the way, for overall energy, and that's going to continue. I doubt electricity demand in this country in 20 years will be substantially higher than it is today, unless the electric vehicle revolution does happen. But even in that case, it's not going to be grid power. It's going to be solar power, probably distributed. Coal, gas, quote, begin their terminal decline in less than a decade. That's Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And I say no gag. There's no golden age of gas coming. I'm sorry if there are people out here who are betting on it. It's just the world passed that by. We've used natural gas as a transition, and it's not going to disappear. It's just not the future. The future is carbon-free power because we've dawdled. Scientists told us to take action 25 years ago. We didn't do it. If we had, we could have made a slow transition. Now we're making a fast transition. Oil, I think, will begin its terminal decline by 2030. Nuclear, which is what originally was going to come here and talk about, the problem with nuclear is that its cost curve goes in the wrong direction. We would need a breakthrough and a price on CO2 to save the nuclear industry. And the other very clear statement is that avoiding catastrophic climate change over the next 10 to 2030s will become the organizing principle for humanity. It will become the organizing principle for all great universities, for all great institutions that are involved any way, shape, or form in energy or water, agriculture, because of what we face if we don't take action. And I'm just go straight through these quickly. So temperatures have been going through the roof. 2014, hottest year on record. 2015, crushed. 2014, 2016 is currently crushing. 2016, not good news. Those of you who may have thought temperatures were like slowing down, let's just call that good PR by the climate deniers. The reality is quite different. This is what we face. Modern civilization and a world of 7 billion people was made entirely possible by 11,000 years of relatively stable climate. That's what allowed modern agricultural systems, cities, people to choose where to live based on stable sea levels, stable rainfall, and places where rainfall wasn't stable, people abandoned. That's why the word desert has the same root as desert. It is a deserted place. People don't adapt to the lack of rainfall, they just leave. Civilization after civilization. So we are here now. If we were really a rational and moral species, we would stop about here. Obviously, that's going to have pretty serious consequences. We've been headed here thanks to the Paris Agreement and the deal that Podesta and Obama signed with the Chinese. We're right now headed about here. But needless to say, none of that's tenable for a world that's going to have 10 billion people in mid-century. Won't spend a lot of time on this since none of you live near the coast. We're in a coastal property bubble. It is going to crash, guaranteed. The reason we know that we're in a bubble is because the only reason people can afford to live near the coast is that there is $1.2 trillion in flood insurance provided courtesy of all the taxpayers. And the next time a category, a Sandy or Katrina hits Miami, it's $100 billion in insured losses, multiple bankruptcies, the state declares bankruptcy. You and I, we're all going to bail them out. Eventually, Congress, I don't know how many bailouts there will be, but they won't go on forever, and then we will pull the plug. And we're not going to keep paying people to live in places that are going to get worse and worse storm surges over time. The literature says a Sandy-level storm surge on our current emissions path every other year starting in mid-century. So this is all going to change, and it doesn't change when sea levels hit 3 or 4 feet higher. It just changes when the smart money gets smart enough to pull out, or the banks say, I'm not going to give you a 30-year mortgage. If you can't get the 30-year mortgage, then only rich people are going to own homes on the coast, and then they'll own them until a storm destroys them, or the federal government simply stops people from doing it. There's just no question. I can't tell you when coastal properties crash. My guess is in the mid to late 2020s, but that Category 4 storm could hit Miami a lot sooner than that. For those of you who live here, the bad news is dust bowlification. This is what I wrote. The article that Tim quoted was an article I had in Nature reviewing the literature. So this is the NASA prediction of 2095 based on a higher end scenario, +3, the dark end, -3. -3 is moderate drought as your normal climate. -3 on the Palmer Drought Severity Index was the average soil moisture during the 8 years of the Dust Bowl. That becomes the normal climate of the breadbasket of the United States, all the way down to, 250 million people who live south of the border. Well, we all know how well we do with refugees, and I'm sure we will welcome with open arms all the people whose livelihoods we've destroyed by ending their coastlines and turning their entire civilization into dust bowls. So this is not tenable. No moral society would ever permit it. No moral society would even risk coming anywhere near this. I think we will get desperate in 10 years. I had hoped we would get desperate this decade rather than next decade. We're serious this decade, finally. Hopefully we will be desperate next decade, and then in the 2030s, we will be so far beyond desperate it'll look like World War II. So let me just zoom through the good news. So we've had a bunch of energy miracles. This is Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Everybody, by the way, should go to Bloomberg New Energy Finance's homepage, find the keynote speech that Chairman Michael Liebrich gave in April. It was actually a response to Bill Gates saying that we need energy miracles. And he said, Jesus Christ, the price of solar power has come down by a factor of 150 in a quarter century, and deployment of solar has gone up 115,000 times. How much more of a miracle do people really need? This is from DOE. This is an update from November 2015 of their 5 technologies pathways. This is just the last 6 years. Land-based wind down 40%, distributed PV down 50%, utility scale PV down 60%. This says modeled battery costs, but this is actual battery costs. Actual battery costs have dropped 70% just since around 2009. And then you have LEDs, which have, in case you didn't know, you can walk into Costco and get an LED for about $3. And there will be nothing but LEDs in 10 years. Take it to the bank. A lot of people are taking it to the bank. You may not know this, but the technology keeps getting better. This is the percentage of time that a wind turbine can run at full capacity. And it started out low, and in just a couple decades, it's doubled. We're now averaging a capacity factor in the mid-20s. There are wind turbines going into Texas that operate at 50%, that operate at their full rated power half of the year. Is this going to continue? Sure, because we're going to go offshore. So this trend is just going to continue as the prices have continued to come down. So what's the cheapest power in the world? This is from Liebrich's presentation. So he was talking in April about onshore wind, a bid of 3 cents a kilowatt hour unsubsidized, and a Mexico bid of 3.6 cents a kilowatt hour, unsubsidized. Since then, Dubai took a bid from the Masdar people for 2.99 cents a kilowatt hour, unsubsidized, and just last month, Chile took a 2.91 cents a kilowatt hour bid, unsubsidized. Half a dozen utilities in this country are building utility-scale solar with the 30% subsidy, which Congress wisely continued for the next few years, at under 4 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, the bid that came into Chile at 2.9 cents a kilowatt hour was half the price of new coal. So it is game over. Now, it's going to take a while for the game over nature of this to trickle in on anyone, but the reality is simply unescapable, particularly because there's a whole bunch of other realities. Since I was going to come here and talk about nuclear power, I have 3 nuclear power slides. So you may not know this, but nuclear power is losing money at an astonishing rate in this country. This is a Brattle Group analysis. And if you know the Brattle Group, the boutique analysis was run by Peter Foxpenner, who was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary before me, and Mike Chupka, who was Acting Assistant Secretary of Policy. Really solid stuff. So the majority of nuclear plants in this country are actually negatively profitable, i.e. they are losing money right now. And they're losing money right now because of shale gas, on the one hand, for your base load, and because nobody can compete against renewables during the day, with solar during the daytime. So this is just a reality. And as a result, those of us who might want to not replace nuclear power with natural gas are faced with a choice. And this was, I'm sorry, I got to mess up. This is the Bloomberg New Energy Finance Analysis. My apologies. This is the Brattle Group analysis. This is the analysis of how much CO2 price would be needed to save the existing nuclear fleet. My apologies on that one. So it turns out that about half of the threatened nuclear fleet could be supported with an average cost per ton of CO2 of below $10 a ton. Not bloody much money at all. And the most expensive would be $75 a ton. So this is just a choice that people are going to have to make. Personally, I would love to extend the lifetime of existing nukes and not put so much pressure on the grid and on renewables to solve every single problem in the next 10 years. But as you can imagine, if half of the existing, already paid for nuclear fleet is unprofitable today, a new nuclear plant makes absolutely no sense. And in fact, there is no market economy in the world building a substantial amount of nuclear plants because they make no financial sense. The only ones that are doing it are your China, your India, and your Russia, countries that don't have a market economy, and their choices about energy are not ruled by the cost. So this is another Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Nuclear has priced itself out of the market. This is actually just the Hinkley plant that Britain has been trying to build for 15 years. The cost of nuclear used to be here compared to baseload. Baseload's gone up a little bit. Hinkley price has gone up way high. And in fact, the grid price is going to keep coming down, and there's no evidence whatsoever that nuclear power is going to reverse its upward trend and suddenly miraculously come on to be 50%, 70% cheaper than it is now. And I note this is not because of U.S. greenies. This is Britain. I note that the French can't even build an affordable, on-schedule, next-generation nuclear plant in their own nuclear-friendly country. This was the Financial Times last September. The plant that they're building in Normandy, initially expected to cost 3 billion euros and start operation in 2012, will not start until 2018 at a cost of 10.5 billion euros. Needless to say, there's no board of directors of any utility in this country or any market economy that can possibly take this kind of investment risk in a world where people are building hundreds and hundreds of gigawatts of wind and solar for literally 1/4 this price. And the IEA itself, which is a fairly conservative organization, but under their recent leadership, they have gotten better at explaining what the future is. So this is the IEA, International Energy Agency, from November. So by 2030, renewables will be the world's primary power source. This is a big deal. Should have gotten more attention at the time. Certainly that was the headline in my blog, so people who read my blog kept up to date. If you didn't know this, this is all the way power is today, dark purple, and here's what's going to be built. And so, yes, we're going to see a bigger cumulative investment in solar and wind than we're going to see in fossil fuels and nuclear power. And that is pretty standard. You can go to Goldman Sachs, you can go to any of those guys. They all know what's happening. And by the way, I would say this still assumes we're going to be building more, we're going to have more coal generation in 2030 than we are in 2014. And I would bet anybody in this room that we're not, that in fact we peaked 2 years ago globally. That's pretty clear. It will become clearer over time. We're certainly not going to be adding, a 2,000 terawatts or gigawatt hours. I forget what the. So the future is. The winner has been determined. Is it going to happen fast enough to avoid catastrophe? That's up to politicians. We get people like Senator Bennett in, it's more likely to happen. But it's going to happen, simply on price, and because the world in Paris said, we commit, 190 nations unanimously said, we're going to do the best we possibly can to stay below 2 degrees centigrade, and if our ideal goal is 1.5 degrees centigrade. In such a world, we don't build more coal. Gas is near its peak. As BloombergNEF Analysis said, we're a decade away at most from the peak in gas in this world that we have entered. Is it conceivable? I mean, could Donald Trump win and right-wing people come in and stop it? They could stop it for a while, but I don't think the future is stoppable. In the interest of time, I won't go through all this. If someone wants to ask a question about all the ways to deal with renewable variability and integration that have led me to say it's a solved issue, I will go through it. But there are so many ways to shift load to the daytime, to store electricity, large-scale batteries, small-scale batteries, thermal storage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I am a fan of keeping some natural gas plants that have been built or will get built in the next 10 years around for when renewables and batteries can't do the job. But otherwise, we're in the midst of a battery deployment miracle. And this is what has happened to the price of batteries since 2008. We're now at $300 a kilowatt hour. The reason why $300 a kilowatt hour is that was the same inflection point that everybody said $1 a watt solar panels would be. This is the point at which it starts to make sense for a consumer to simply consider a vehicle. It's the point at which I can build a 200-plus mile range vehicle, and I can price it in the 30s, in the 30,000s. And that's what both GM and Tesla have announced. And that's, by the way, with batteries in this price. Batteries are going down to this price because we've not finished the learning curve on batteries. We just started the learning curve on batteries. Batteries are going to go down to half that price. And so at this level, the first cost of your 300-mile plus range electric vehicle is cheaper than the first cost of the exact same gasoline-powered car. Your maintenance cost is substantially less because you have 1/3 the parts. You don't have all that transmission crap to deal with. Don't have all that oil crap to deal with. Sorry. And your fueling costs are at least 1/3. And if we move into this era in the 2020s where a state like Colorado has this abundance of low-cost 2 cents a kilowatt hour solar, then you'll be signing deals, the utilities will be signing deals with GM and Tesla. We're going to put in a control system. The control system is going to let you, the utility, decide exactly when we charge this up. You just have to guarantee, an 80% state of charge in this window. And all of you who own these cars will opt in. And if you happen to need the car in the middle of the day for a long trip, you will opt out. But the utility will simply decide it will have all these cars that it can charge whenever it wants to suck up all the solar energy it needs. So by itself, the battery miracle and the electric vehicle revolution, completely solve the solar energy integration problem over the course of the next 10 years. And we have an EV deployment miracle. There were no substantial EVs deployed in 2010. We have gone up a curve that looks like this. We're now at 500,000 vehicles a year. What's interesting is that China has decided, just like they decided, hey, solar and wind, that's the technology of the clean future, the carbon-safe future. We're going to spend money to be the leaders in deployment and technology. They're betting the farm on electric vehicles and batteries. So China tripled last year, passing the U.S. Chinese plan is a factor of 10 increase by 2025. Currently a 60% EV subsidy in China. Also, for those of you who know how the cities, the polluted cities in China operate, it's very hard to get a permit for a new car. Not hard to get a permit for a new car if it's an electric vehicle. So there are many ways to incentivize the market. So they are on the process of taking over this market. But we do have Tesla, and I spoke to the Proterra, a former Tesla guy who's running the best electric bus program in the world, the best electric bus program in the United States, which is going to take over the market. He told me, he said, within 10 years, there's no reason for gasoline in the urban drive cycle. And buses are now, diesel buses, they break down all the time and they're expensive to run. We already have comparable first costs on electric bus versus a diesel bus, much lower maintenance and fuel costs. In a few years, the battery buses are actually cheaper first costs. So in 10 years, not going to see a lot of diesel buses left on the road. And then the batteries, of course, don't just get used in cars. They're going to be used solar paired with batteries. This is Bloomberg New Energy Finance again. If you didn't have these cheap batteries, you might limit solar. But and frankly, I think they're being conservative. By the time you get to 2025, you should have a 50 kilowatt hour battery with a 10-year warranty to put in your house for solar power. We've crossed the $300 kilowatt hour threshold for car-based batteries, but car-based batteries have to be a lot better because they got to cycle a lot during a day. And what there is now emerging, and you can Google this, Google second-use batteries. Every single car company is planning, after 10 years of use of their battery, it no longer works for a car, they're going to warranty it in the second-use market for electricity storage, which doesn't cycle up 50 times a day. It just goes up once, and it goes down once. And those already now, Nissan is giving a 10-year warranty to some people for a second use of their Nissan Leaf battery for $100 a kilowatt hour. So the world has changed, and like I said, it will take a few more years to be obvious to everyone else. But as someone who worked at the Department of Energy and knew what was going to happen in the 1990s, it's just pleasant to see. This is a Bloomberg New Energy Finance. So when does oil peak? Okay, the people who thought supply was going to peak, they were wrong. It turns out we're more ingenious than we thought, but it turns out we're also more ingenious than we thought on the alternative front. So if you do, in fact, get an electric vehicle system, urban transport, in which your first cost is less, your maintenance cost is less, and your fuel cost is 1/5, and I didn't talk about the super fast charging. Right now, Tesla putting in around the country super fast chargers that can give you an 80% charge in 20 minutes. And that is not going to be the state of the art in 10 years. I can guarantee that Walmart is simply going to give away. You come to Walmart, they're going to have solar up the wazoo on the roof. They're going to say, you just plug in, shop, don't worry, we're not charging you, because it's going to be pennies for them anyway. So the world is going to morph into a world where there's charging in a lot of places. There's super fast charging near the place where you go to have a snack on the road and go to the bathroom, and when you're done, boom, it's charged and you go on your way. By the way, this means essentially coal, oil, and gas prices stay low forever. So I'm sorry if you're in that business. There may be spikes along the way because we have a wild situation internationally, and you never know what could happen. But fundamentally, we're simply not going to use, we have to leave, as you may know, 2/3 of the fossil fuels in the ground, or you hit 2 degrees centigrade, which the world said it's not going to do. Now, if I were a betting person, I would say we probably are going to hit 2 degrees centigrade, but we're not going to go to 3 degrees centigrade, because we're just not that stupid a species when we get around to it. And when the alternatives are like sitting there staring us in the face. This is all made possible by Germany and China. right? Germany made huge investments in solar when it wasn't very cost effective. And the Chinese have made massive investments in all these technologies. They brought us down the learning curve so that now those of us who are purely capitalistic and greedy are going to end up with these technologies. And I think the oil path, this is Bernstein Research, will probably look like this. So this is a peak around 2030, 2035, and then it comes down. And the reason I know that it's going to keep doing this is because the climate situation is not getting better. You read it, someone was just telling me Boulder is getting a 1,000-year flood every 4 or 5 years, right? So that's not getting better, it's going to get worse. So we will be more desperate in the 2020s, and we will ramp up deployment even more. Technology costs will come down even more. So this is a transition. I was speaking to Al Gore at a speaker training. I was interviewing him, and he said, this is a transition like the Industrial Revolution and the Information Revolution combined, because it has the scale of the Industrial Revolution, but the speed of the Information Revolution. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on LEDs. LEDs have gone from 1% of the market in 2010 to what is already 20%, 28% worldwide, substantially more than that in the US, and it will simply be the whole market in 2025. This is the global market. And LEDs are just a very good example of a small green device that can come down the learning curve better. And as a result, by the way, this is Goldman Sachs, I'm sorry. This is Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs came out with a big report on the low carbon future last month. This is Goldman Sachs, and this is Goldman Sachs. So just lighting is going to drop from 521 terawatt hours to 283 terawatt hours in a 10-year time frame. So this curve, the Amory and Hunter-Levin's curve, was right. So this is electricity demand in the US. Flat. And it's going to be flat as the eye can see, because we got LEDs coming along, and of course we have rooftop solar, which doesn't show up in the utility scale figures. So if you thought we were going to be building any new nuclear plants, we're not. We're just going to shut down the dirty ones and replace them with the super cheap clean ones as they come along. We'll keep the nuclear as long as people figure out if they want to subsidize them or not. And by the way, the reason this is because energy efficiency spending has gone through the roof. So that before, in 2006, this is the amount of energy efficiency spending, equivalent to about 0.2% of demand a year. It's now, and this is incremental, this is not cumulative, energy efficiency programs, utility energy efficiency programs around the country are now saving 0.7% of demand every year. Why? Because states all of a sudden caught on that what your California and your Massachusetts were doing made sense. Why don't we decouple sales from profits so utilities aren't incentivized to keep selling you more of their profit? Why don't we set an energy efficiency resource standard? And the states so you have the states that do decoupling only, states that do the resource standard only, and then you have the states that do the two combined. So we've had a step function change in energy efficiency. So demand is going to be flat as far as the eye can see. And this is overall U.S. energy demand. U.S. energy demand, flat GDP. If you didn't think it was going to happen, Amory said it was going to happen 30 years ago. It just took a little while for the technology and the policies to catch up to him. I do want to put in one slide before I end, because I feel I haven't been sufficiently provocative. So carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. What we've learned in the last 2 or 3 years is that carbon dioxide is actually a direct pollutant. And that if you run an experiment at 500 parts per million, right now outside air is about 400 parts per million. Indoor air is always higher because we're breathing out 3,000 or 4,000 parts per million, all of us. And when you crowd us together in a room or in a classroom or on an airplane, it shoots through the roof. I have my CO2 monitor, and I had it on the plane with me. On the flight out here, CO2 levels, 1,500 parts per million. Now, this is a test. This is a cognitive test run by Harvard School of Public Health. This was a specially designed cognitive test for actually testing medical interns to see whether they lost cognitive skills after working for 24 straight hours. Most tests are task-oriented. Can I copy numbers? That sort of thing. These are actually SimCity-type tests of strategy and information usage and crisis response. So as it turns out, as you crank up the indoor CO2, what happens? Well, you've all been in crowded meeting rooms that seem to get stuffy and unproductive as the day goes along, and that's probably because you thought the speaker was dull or the topic was dull, and it may well have been. But it is a fact of the matter that as you get to 1,000 parts per million, which is pretty standard. By the way, the law in this country is 1,000 parts per million. That's the ASHRAE standard. That's what buildings are designed for, because nobody until recently have thought that indoor CO2 was a pollutant. There are lots of people where the CO2 levels are higher who are incredibly interested about this, including NASA. Like I said, you should be worried about the cockpit of your airplane, because we're here. In most airplanes are 1,500, 2,000 parts per million. So we're going to see a design revolution in buildings. I presented this, and the scientists from Harvard presented this at the U.S. Green Building Council in November. Over the next 5 to 10 years, buildings are going to be designed to take this into effect. By the way, the worst, just so you have something else to worry about, is classrooms. Your kids are in a crowded area. They're old buildings, not well ventilated, not well maintained, and they breathe a lot. So your standard, a third of the classrooms in Texas have over 2,000 parts per million of CO2 indoors, directly correlated with test scores. In case the higher CO2 indoors, the worse the test scores. I spoke with the British guy who examined all the British schools, and his recommendation to the British government was put a CO2 monitor in every classroom, and when it hits 1,000 parts per million, open the window. Because there's no one maintaining the HVAC system, but most of them have operable windows. So you're going to see, we're seeing an explosion in green buildings, and this is just going to spur it along. And so just to end with why climate action matters. So normally people do this as a temperature curve. We were headed to 900 parts per million. If everybody did what they said they would do in Paris, do the intended national agreements, we would get to 675. But Paris stops. The commitments all end in 2030. Ours end in 2025. The only way to get to the sustainable path of 480 parts per million or lower is if every 5 years we ratchet down the CO2 commitments. And that's what Paris says. We come back every 5 years, we ratchet down the levels, ratchet down the levels, ratchet down the levels. Ultimately, everyone's got to go to zero. By the way, this is concentration. CO2 levels have to go to zero in the middle of the second half of the century in order to have a shot at 2 degrees centigrade. So everyone in the whole world's going to zero, including the United States of America, as hard as it may be to believe. Or else we're just going to end up somewhere in here, have 3 degrees centigrade warming, 5-6 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, and rising an inch a year after that, and dust bowlification, all those things that no rational moral society would ever do. I just point this out because the indoor CO2 levels is always going to be higher than the outdoor. So if you actually want to keep indoor levels below 1,000 parts per million, you better keep, if you want indoor below 1,000, you better keep outdoor below 500, because it's just really hard to ventilate a building well enough to not have a 2 to 3 or 400 parts per million difference between indoors and outdoors. So we're just doing this one-shot experiment on all of humanity, all of society, and it's not going the right direction. I will mention, next to last slide, I'm Chief Science Advisor for Years of Living Dangerously, the TV series that was on Showtime, which you probably didn't see because it was on Showtime, but it's going to be on National Geographic Channel. It's the one executive produced by James Cameron and Arnold Schwarzenegger. 2 60 Minutes producers who have 13 Emmys between them, do all the filming. Episode 1, they use celebrities as correspondents. Episode 1 has David Letterman going to India to look at the renewable versus coal issue there. Episode 2 has Jack Black going down to Miami to look at the flooding there. Part of that is an episode on putting a price on carbon. If you're wondering what the university can do and what you all can do, is to get involved in getting a price on carbon. Because as fast as that clean energy sweeps in, you still have to have an orderly shutdown of existing fossil fuel plants, or you don't get to 2 degrees centigrade. All the clean energy in the world is great, but if you were to run every coal plant in the world as long as you can run them, and we all know now you can run coal plants 60, 70 years if you want, you need a way of shutting them down in an orderly fashion. And obviously the most economically sound, business-friendly way is a slowly rising price on CO2. So we have a Put a Price on It campaign, and students and others can participate by going to the climatesolution.com and hashtag Put a Price on It. So I'll just end by saying, so the world has changed. Hopefully there was one of these slides that you weren't aware of before I presented it. I totally realize this is not where 99% of the media is. It's not where the intelligentsia are. The New York Times coverage of this is so terrible. I write about it routinely. But this is what's happening. So the world is in the process of a change, the change of innovation, and how fast we change is, innovation plus desperation. So when we get to the desperation part, could we, in fact, replace the entire energy system of the world in 40 to 50 years with carbon-free stuff? Yes, we could. Would it be bad for the economy? No. The GDP growth would not measurably change, and there would be so many ancillary benefits that there would, in fact, be an explosion. Does the fact that the energy industry in this country have $1 trillion a year energy bill and therefore have an awful lot of money to spend to slow that down and stop it, and state by state fight renewable laws and make it so that you can't sell electric vehicles easily? Yes, they do. But I don't think they can beat, ultimately, the technology. They could just slow things down enough so we don't avoid catastrophic warming. But ultimately, we're talking about an inevitable transition, an inevitable future, and hopefully be guided by wise politicians. And if you want to stay up to date, you can come to climateprogress.org. You can get my book. I have copies of my book which go through a great deal of this. It's all in Q&A format, so it's very easy to read. There's 90 question answers, everything you wanted to know. Thank you very much.
Country. And part of being an energy country is thinking about fracking. So let me ask, what do we want to know? If you are, day after the election, are asked by the president-elect to come in and give him or her your recommendation on what our policies ought to be related to fracking, how would you answer?
At the risk of, we should just stop the whole damn thing. Again, the future is known. The technologies are moving in a direction that anybody can see. So, if you want to run existing gas plants a bit longer so you can make the transition off of coal a bit easier, I'm all for it. But if you're saying I got to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on new natural gas infrastructure, which will be totally unnecessary, if not counterproductive, in 20 years, it's just not good business. Now, I realize it's not the way the business of the country works. It can work that way in China. It's the only good thing about having that form of government. I'm not in favor of that form of government or Vladimir Putin, but when they get the right idea, they can act faster. When they get the wrong idea, unfortunately, they can also act faster. So yeah, there's no, and plus, so we're poisoning groundwater. we're creating earthquakes. I mean, what did the guy say? There have been 1,000 years of earthquakes in Oklahoma in the last 5 years. So what is it worth it? It's certainly, I understand there are people in this state and elsewhere who make a great deal of money off of it, but it does no good for the general welfare of the country to which everybody is presumably dedicated. And as an aside, because I have written more about this perhaps than anyone on the planet, it's actually not even good for the climate. And it's not good for the climate for two reasons, one of which is that methane is mostly natural gas, and it is impossible to do large-scale fracking, transportation, distribution without leaking a little methane. And once you hit a 4% leak of methane, you are wiping out a substantial fraction of the benefit of switching to coal to gas. And there's dozen studies on that. And just to pour salt in the wounds, all of the idea that fracking is a good idea is based on the notion that fracking only replaces coal. But fracking doesn't only replace coal. And when the Stanford Energy Modeling people modeled what fracking actually replaces, which is coal, nuclear, efficiency, solar, and wind, all of a sudden that 50% benefit from just going from coal to gas disappears entirely. So I am here to tell you that fracking is doing nothing good for the climate, and generally it's just not the future.
So there you have it. Joe, we've gotten to 2 o'clock, and we thank you very much for being here. For all of us, the more we know about climate, the more engaged we all are going to be about climate, the more relevant all of the issues that Marshall raises are, the relationship to population, the relationships to livability of the world get clearer and clearer and clearer. And you have helped us to understand that, and we thank you very much for coming to Denver, and we thank you all here very much for coming for lunch. We'll see you next year, if not before. Thank you.